The Manchus were very successful at establishing a foreign dynasty in China for many reasons. They were a mixed agricultural and hunting people that were descendants of the people who had established a kingdom in northern China in the early 13th century for a short time. They ordered all the Chinese to adopt Manchu dress and hairstyles so that it would be easier to identify the rebels. Men were to shave their foreheads and braid their hair into a queue. If you didn't do this, you were killed. Another reason why they were so successful was because they didn't try to impose their own way of ruling. They adopted the Chinese political system, which caused most Chinese to gradually accept them as the rulers of the country. They gained their acceptance also by stressing their devotion to the principles of Confucianism. Their rulers in the beginning were very strong and able to make peace in the country, which helped them to establish a dynasty. There were many main characteristics of their rule. The dynasty they established was the Qing dynasty. When Zhang Hai was a ruler, he supported the arts and letters and created the support of scholars. Christianity was tolerant under the Zhang Hai as well. The Manchus, which were represented less than 2% of the population, were legally classified differently from the rest of the population in China. Only the Manchus could settle in Manchuria. However, they did create a diarchy. This was a system in which all important administrative positions were shared equally between the Chinese and the Manchus. This helped win over the loyalty of the Chinese. China was at the height of its power and glory during the Manchu rule. They had an expensive military campaigns along the frontier. The impact of European expansion onto Southeast Asia traces its roots back to the late 15th century with a series of voyages that sought at a sea passage to India in the hope of establishing direct trade between Europe and Asia in spices. Before 1500, European economies were largely self-sufficient, only supplemented by minor trade with Asia and Africa. Within the next century, however, European and Asian economies were slowly becoming integrated through the rise of global trade routes, and the early thrust of European political power, commerce, and culture in Asia gave rise to a growing trade in worthwhile merchandise. The 16th century brought many Jesuit missionaries to China, such as Matteo Ricci, who established missions where Western science was introduced and where Europeans gathered knowledge of the Chinese society, culture, history, and science. They drew connections between both the Christian and Confucian concepts, while European inventions impressed Chinese officials. Things such as the clock, prism, and various astronomical and musical instruments began to be introduced into Chinese society. During the 18th century, merchants from Western Europe came to China in increasing numbers. In the 16th century, the Portuguese established a monopoly over trade between Asia and Europe by managing to prevent rival powers from using the water routes between Europe and the Indian Ocean. However, with the rise and arrival of Dutch East Indian Company, the Portuguese influence in Asia was gradually eclipsed. The arrival of both the Dutch and English disrupted the silver trade, making it plummet and therefore straining the Chinese economy. Dutch forces first established independent bases in the east, and then between 1640 and 1660 wrestled Malacca, Ceylon, and most southern Indian ports, and Japanese trade from the Portuguese. Later, the English and the French established settlements in India and established trade with China, and their own acquisitions would gradually surpass those of the Dutch. Following the end of the Seven Years' War in 1763, the British eliminated the French influence in India and established the British East India Company as the most important political force on the Indian subcontinent. In the mid-16th century, three very powerful political figures emerged: Odawa Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1568, Nobunaga seized the imperial capital of Kyoto and placed the reigning shogun under his domination. He tried to consolidate his rule by defeating his rivals and suppressing the power of the Buddhist estates, but he was killed by one of his generals before he could carry out his plan. Hideyoshi was his successor. He extended his power outward toward the southern islands of Shikoku and Kyushu. By 1590, he had persuaded most of the daimyo on the Japanese islands to accept his authority and created a national currency. Both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi were unable to eliminate the power of the local daimyo. They had to form alliances with the daimyo in order to destroy other more powerful rivals. After Hideyoshi's death, Tokugawa, the most powerful daimyo of Edo, took over. He named himself shogun and completed the restoration of central authority and remained in power until 1868 when war broke out. The Tokugawa rulers maintained the unity by changing the social system and having a centralized empire. society. But during the Tokugawa era, the Japanese saw a drop in farmers due to the declining profits, rising costs, and taxes. Instead, trading became much more popular. Portugal was a normal trader, but they also took part in regional trade between Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. Goods such as tobacco, clocks, and European products such as weapons and armaments were exchanged in trade. Commerce and manufacturing also began to play a significant role in society. The merchant class began to emerge stronger than ever. Their major manufacturing product was cotton. The traditional Japanese system was at a point of anarchy when the Tokugawa era came into reign at about the end of the 15th century. In order to strengthen the government, Bakufu was introduced. Bakufu is a coalition of daimyo and council of elders that made the government more centralized. The shogunate was still in play too. The Japanese thus had an emperor but were ruled under the shogun's own domain. Another change in the system was the limit of the samurai class. Samurais were not seen as above the commoner anymore, but instead as a commoner. The Tokugawa culture was like the past because they were still influenced by Confucian themes, Buddhist quietism, and the samurai tradition, but the new culture values appeared, such as literature written by and for the townspeople. In effect, literacy levels rose. Also, the competition for the most magnificent building began, and the construction of these castles and mansions became a casual sight. Paintings, architecture, textile, and ceramics all flourished during this era. Japanese art was influenced by the rapid growth of cities. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, China remained mostly an agricultural society where nearly 85% of the people were farmers. Although most of China was still rural, there was still a number of economical and social changes occurring that seemed to be leading China towards an industrial revolution like in the West. First, there was a significant population increase from about 70 to 80 million in 1390 to over 300 million at the end of the 18th century. This increase is mostly attributed to the relatively long period of peace and stability under the early Qing, as well as the introduction of new crops from the Americas. Another change that took place during the early modern period in China was the steady growth in manufacturing and commerce. Merchants began to expand their businesses, and commercial networks began to develop as well. Although the rise in industrial and commercial activity resembles a change occurring in Western Europe, they differed in a few ways. In China, the government controlled trade, whereas in Europe it was not. Additionally, ancient Chinese thoughts of agriculture before manufacturing caused heavy taxes to be placed on trade. These differences caused a technological gap to develop between China and Europe.